First, thank you for inviting me, Javier. Perfect. So first, as I was telling you, thank you for the invitation, and I want to share some part of the content that I have been working since many years with you. That at the end includes part of my life in general terms. So as Javier was explaining, it's all about design, architecture, art, art management that is quite important for me. And as we were talking about art, beauty, and silence, I want to give you a brief introduction about my life first. I was born and raised in the last project built by Luis Barragán. The name is Casa Giraldi, and the house was commissioned through my father Martin Luque and my father's best friend that was Pancho Gilardi. They were quite important for understanding this project because they have an advertising studio that is an important influence that I was born and raised with. My father was a PR of music and arts, so the understanding of art in any single activity of my life it's part of the essence. And this house was designed as a bachelor path, as a bachelor house, because they were 28, 34, having an advertising studio. Luis
Yeah, I mean,
Barragán context is important because he was 74, came back from 10 years of the retirement, and Luis Barragán always talks about one main concept that the name is the emotional architecture. So the idea is to understand or embrace human needs, all the interdiscipline of arts. So he always talks about the context to understand vernacular architecture, to respond to a specific context, such as weather, people, tradition, philosophy, religion. And it will be completely normal for us, especially for you that, of course, you are younger than Javier and me, but that now we'll live or we try to understand everything just into a general matter. Sometimes we make something obvious, we try to think that all the people from all parts of the world live in the same way, have the same understanding of design, art, and architecture. And it is not like that. So remembering, and sorry for this, it will sound maybe repetitive, but remembering the context of the architect or any specific artist is such an important concept. So starting with the first slide, the elements that I want to show you, it's understanding reference, why references are so important, and how we can see them, make a study of them, and make a complete different execution with these references. So I will start first with the house, with Luis Barragan architecture. The first one into the left, it's a small town in Italy, and the idea of vernacular architecture is that the architecture is adapting to nature. So as you can notice, you cannot see clearly where is the beginning of one house, where is the end of the other one, and it's just adapting to the mountain. So something important about the next picture, that is the one in the right side in the top, is that it's an abstraction of a painting by Jose Clemente Orozco, that he was one of the main Mexican muralists. So this one is going to take us to an important concept for me that is light, the understanding of light as a duality between shadows, bright spaces, to understand that our perception of depth is always defined through saturation. The saturated elements are the first elements that we all perceive first and give us that sensation of depth. I'm sure that is something that you already know, the way that we emphasize, especially when we draw. But something important about this layer, if you can pay a bit of your attention, is that you will notice that the painter was doing a contrast between the spaces that we normally receive light and when we or in the layers when it's supposed to have a reflection of light, he embraced the shadows. So it's not a real feature. But this is important because it's all about metaphysical concepts, imaginary concepts. Stop understanding everything just to rational elements. Try to understand through spiritual needs, emotion, senses. And this is something quite important that I learned from the house, from the architect's work, from my father approach is to break that conception of reality, to truly open our heads, to try to imagine concepts and trying to execute that in our own work, in our own design. And that is timeless. That is something that helps us to break that conception of time. All these references, you can see them connected with other artists that we are going to talk through to the slides. And the one that is from below in the right side, it's there are some courtyards and terraces of the home. So as you can notice, the space that Luis Barragán execute is an abstraction from a place that he already saw, but especially from a painting that he abstract with. So this is why I want to start with this one to understand this constant circle that it will be reflected in in all my creative process actually. The second one is also quite important because in the left side is Giorgio di Chirico Piazza's. He was a metaphysic artist. He was one of Luis Barragán's main references, and it's one of the first artists that I received an education with. And as you can notice, it's a constant concept of embracing depth to shadows to light. You cannot truly see what is happening there. So we need to start using all our imagination to understand those spaces that they not necessarily has to be a real space. So this is quite important to break up all our imagination. And in the right side is a picture that I took in an artistic residency that I got invited in Iran. So it's important because you can notice the beginning of the sources that in this case the architect, in this case the artist Giorgio di Chirico, Luis Barragan took references of. So it's all about transitions. It's all about to understand physical transitions through the spaces, how he compressed, how he expanded, how he give us an approach with outer spaces, but especially between shadows and light. So as you can notice, that photography is one of my main references to remember the home, to remember in this case Iran, but especially Giorgio de Chirico artwork. So it's a clear important reference that you will see in my work, but especially with shadows and lights. I want to be clear that this will be more about this important duality of shadows and light. to create that negative approach of a space so then we can understand the approach of light. Basically, is working as a cave. Everything is dark, and then you start making holes. You start defining light to the space. It's not a glass house. It's not an open window space. The idea is to define it. So it will be this constant duality of shadows and light, but especially between rough and smooth. It's a focus point, how the space is giving us this sensation that is going deeper. So as a common practice in my work, I try to break the conception of a real space, especially architecture, to start making a complete different composition. It's all about the sequence. It's all about how people start making their own conclusions when they start watching these kind of pieces or these kind of spaces. So it's all about saturation. That is something quite important for me. If someone already have read the Interaction of Color book by Joseph Alders, you will understand me better. So the idea is that our eye need to focus an important saturated element to start perceiving depth, to start perceiving space, but especially how we can play with that focus side to change the conception, the elements that we are going to start watching. So the one in the left side is a sequence from the same of the right side, is a hallway, but it's all about darkness. It's all about understanding the space from the outside. The only element that you can see is actually light, but it's embracing through the darkness that we have. In the one that we have in the right side is a contraposition of the main perspective of that space. So you can notice how it's going deeper into the dark space. Later, I will show you, sorry, a clear image of that space. But I want to talk more about this contrast to understand how, for me, it's important to see the space and create a complete different composition only using light, shadows and light. So in the first one that we have in the left side, it's an important concept for me that in Mexico we call it umbral. You can understanding also as a portal, as a threshold. And the idea is that the space or the perception of the space is just defining through the light, to the light elements that we have. The second one, I truly enjoy working with the saturation, with changing the perception maybe of the original color and changing to light. It's important also to remember that color is the consequence of light. Color is a human perception, it's a psychological approach from our eyes to our brain, but the elements that we perceive first is always light. So the idea is to play, to break that imaginary subject that I was telling you since the beginning. And the second one, I mean, the third one is an oculus, also from Iran, from this project that I was telling you. The idea is that these architects, artists, wants to make us see the elements that we already forgot to see in our daily basics. And again, everything is darkness. So depending on the position of the sun, the element that you will start watching, it will be always different. So this is quite important for me because it will be always changing. Luis Barragán practiced a philosophical approach that is named asceticism or aesthetic. So it's a Franciscan philosophy that talks about silence, austerity, dualities, but especially the understanding of the constant change. Change is the only constant in life. So again, the idea is to have a complete different relation that everything will be changing through the time. And then we are going to come back to understand some of the perspective of the house. But I want to show you the perspective first and then you can understand. But this is quite important to understand my work, to understand the sources or part of the sources of the inspiration of my work, but especially the architecture that I have an important influence. Of course, you can notice in the first one, in the left side, in the top, that is all about the reflection. Is the same wall, is the same color, but our perception of the layers change through light to that specific position of light. So you can notice that we are going into cinetic artwork, how it will be constantly changing. Then in the next one, it's also important because it's maybe the most simple sample of dark and bright spaces, shadows and light working in the same layer. In the third one is a swimming pool area that is a more complex space, but the idea is to start making a complete different composition. How from any position of the space, the perspective will feel clearly different. And this is important. How would these architects, they will break our conception of the archetypes. Our generation are getting more used to understand just one image or one way to understand a living room, a kitchen, a swimming pool. So the idea again is to understand that we can all have a complete different approach in the execution of the spaces. So this is why this architecture is mainly influenced through vernacular architecture, Mexican pre-Hispanic architecture, the influence that we got from Middle East, colonial architecture. So have you ever been in Middle East, North Africa, Morocco, south of Spain, you will understand me better. Nature is understood as a need, as a human need, not as a decoration. So for us being involved with nature, it will be a constant as a need. This is why the fourth picture is important. This house was designed around a tree. It's a jacaranda tree. It's the one that have purple flowers. So Barragán used the exact same color of the flower of the tree in some of his layers. So during spring, the flowers, the wall colors get matched. And again, it's all about to understand that that effect, it will be only possible to see just during spring. So the idea of a constant change will be always present. Then the fourth one, it's again more about the position of the sun, how you have a specific perspective that you cannot see clearly what is happening on that space. So it's this constant approach to understand or actually to feel more the image that understand or trying to understand, I mean, in a rational way only the spaces. The next one is also to understand saturation, to understand passages, how I like to saturate one space more than another. So our focus part of the eyes are going deeper in one side than the other. So you can change into the position, you can modulate light, and the same space will feel as a complete different piece. This element that now I want to show you, it's quite important because the idea is to define light as an element into the space. If you can see this pink pillar, the right side we have the blue walls. Going into the top, we only have two skylights. It's not like a rooftop, they are just two skylights, and that is the only light that this space receives, thinking about natural light. So as I was telling you, in the first layers, he was a master of controlling light to understand that you need darkness and then you embrace light. That pink pillar is so important because you will notice that it's the first element that we all focus. So, sorry. Okay, as we're talking about light, saturation, I want to share you the second one. In the left side, we have part of the main courtyard. This idea to emphasize in
Yeah.
layering shadows, to emphasize depth. And in the one in the right side, we have already the composition that I have been working since many years to catch natural light, to change the conception of the space, just to the modulation of light. And this next one that I want to show you is so important because he's one of my biggest influences and is an important element thinking about this space. Why? Because the swimming pool that this space that you are watching is actually a swimming pool is used as the only illumination of that area that is next to the main dining table. So how it works is quite fascinating because the color of the bottom, as you can see, it's an emerald green. Only the bottom have this color, and the light is projected from underneath, is from inside of the water. So when it's getting darker, it's just getting warmer. When you start embracing darkness, the saturation of these colors are getting more important, and the concept of saturation is giving us this sense of depth. As you can notice in the first one into your left, how the color of the pillar seems to be different from below of the water and going into the top. So that is the example how the light changed this conception. If you notice also from below in the blue happens the same. In the right side into the white is going into the same. So in the second one, in the right side, you can notice how he plays with the layers, how the space are going or making us feel that they are going deeper, but especially it's again the imaginary subject as a beautiful, sculptorical, spiritual space, but is defined through a human action that is meant to swim, have a heater, have a filter, is completely functional. So the idea to understand that beauty is part of every single activity of our lives, and that utilitarian has not the specific need to be ugly. It can be also beautiful, that we can share both sides. And the next one that I want to show you, it's more about my work, how I start taking all these reference that I have been showing to you And this will be more about also your own appreciation. I don't like to over explain all the concepts that you will see, but again, as you can notice, it's breaking the real conception of the space, making our my own reflection. Something that I start working with is through photography, and I like to spend time in the spaces so I can have a complete different execution of the light to understand truly the natural context. And then I start working with it. In the right side, it's the way that I like to work in the saturation of the space with natural light, but also through artificial light to start making a complete different composition and change the relation or the real relation that the space already have. And this is something that I also produce in my home, at my studio, working with all these layerings, but I always do it with natural light. I never touch the image, and this is something quite important for me. It will remind you maybe a bit of cinema, how they work, how they start controlling all the atmospheres to have a complete different execution of the space. As I was telling you in the beginning, my father have an advertising studio and he always works in printing. So printing was or it has been something quite important for me, graphic arts. So the way that we can modulate the execution into the materials is something quite important. Then these ones that I want to show you, it's going only into shadows and lights to understand how I like to have a complete different proposal to make a composition of spaces that can feel completely different in a real way, to project light, to change my own position, also to work with printing, but especially texture. Texture is quite important to remember in art, in architecture, in this case in photography. So the idea is that you can try to focus any specific space, and the layers will feel always that they are moving, they are always changing. And if you start placing this, I mean, in a real printing, in a real space, it will be always different. So this is the work that I had been producing. The one in the right side is actually a real space that I want to share with you. Is the Jewish Museum. It's in San Francisco. It was designed by Daniel Libeskind. And the idea again is to understand the perception of the space layers with shadows and lights. So these two pictures are so important for me because it will be maybe clear for you to remember that architecture, art, light, photography, sculpture are always present in the same pieces. In all the pieces, we'll feel always this resemblance. These ones are also quite important because you can notice in the one in the left that the idea is to understand and modulate light. So I start controlling the light. So the light is the one that is changing the same conception of the space. So the idea is to spend time to start notice how the space conception will change. But again, it's all through light. It's all through the compositions that I start working with it. And the one in the right side, it's more about saturation. Again, making different compositions, start playing with depth, start changing the conception of the space. So taking references from real spaces and making some pieces, or in the other ways, taking pieces and changing into space. That working with architecture is so important for me. This is why these next pictures are so important in the way that I understand composition, thinking about architecture, thinking about an art piece that I produce, maybe as a sculpture, maybe as a painting, but they are all related. Why I like to share these together is because they always have a connection to understand the art disciplines, that they are all connected but have a complete different execution of them. And the one in the left is important because it's a real space. So again, how our position is so important to emphasizing depth. This is all the elements that we are actually watching, observing, feeling, but sometimes we are not conscious in a rational way why we feel one space in a specific way. So the next one that I want to share you, it will be maybe more obvious, but this is the way that I work to embracing saturation to understand the real space. So the one in the left side is actually a true space, and the one into the right side, again, it's not addition, it's the modulation with the saturation of light. So it's just through the camera to understand what is the real movement of the light into the spaces. So this is why this piece is so important for me. And for the last two, I want to show you part of some pieces of the last exhibition that I have the opportunity to work. The space was designed by my brother. It's a spiritual meditation space, almost as a temple that we design and we define only through light. As you can notice for my family, this concept is so important. I have the opportunity to work in the design of the projects, but I have the study light, the models of the light first when the project was an intervention of a real space that we change. So this is why it's so important to understand what is the movement of light, but how you can control and give a complete different execution of light with the same space. The idea, this is more a representation of graphic arts. Everything is offset. So we start doing everything in a manual way and play with it to change the saturation of the original pictures while we were actually printing. And then the golden, the red painting is actually clearly painting directly to the pieces. So it's more about symbolism, it's more about composition, how the spiritual need, symbolism, religion is something quite important to see in these kind of pieces, especially for me. But at the end, again, is making a complete different composition of one space that is already existent. So, like the first one that I show you, it's taking references to understand that we don't have to make a complete different or the same execution of the same space, the same piece, that we can all be watching the same space and have a complete different perspective of them. So again, as you can notice in these two last pieces, it's all about shadows, it's all about light. So why is so important to understand? And the last concept that I want to share with you is all about silence. They always says that the secret of timeless architecture, timeless pieces is silence, because silence take you to contemplation. And in contemplation is the moment when you can feel your own relation with the space, nature, with the pieces, and making your own conclusion, making your own relations. So this is all about the slides. I don't know if someone have any or anything that do you want me to explain about the spaces, about the photography, about the graphic arts, or anything.
I have a few questions, but I will let people ask their questions.
Please.
I have a question. So the course is centered around the students building a portfolio for themselves. So
Okay.
their work might not be as conceptually defined as somebody like yourself. You get to work and see a lot of people of various backgrounds and disciplines. Um, have you ever been in a position where um, you had to give advice to somebody who was developing their own voice as a designer? And what advice would you give somebody who's a bit lost?
Perfect. So I think your question is quite interesting, and I have been working in the curational side of exhibitions, and big part of my life I have been explaining a space designed by an architect, and my best advice first will be trying to understand all the contexts. The context is always important. I think about time, about nature, about the process of the artist. That will be maybe more into you thinking about design, maybe more about like printing, photography, is to have the opportunity to show your process so people can get more along about it. In the last exhibition that I have the opportunity to produce, having the opportunity to work with the artist is essential because you can notice more about their own process. So the idea is to understand like their own universe, to understand or try to understand how they work, the characteristics that they want to project, the ideas that they want to share, and to write all these ideas, to write them back, to try to make almost as a briefing, as a book, and have the execution in your portfolio is so important. So the best is that with someone can take your own portfolio and they will understand it. For me, it's important always to do it as a piece, almost as a book, almost to share it, to share a story that people can understand. Because something that I experienced since I was a kid is that sometimes we talk about concepts and we believe that everyone is truly understanding us. So have that approach to share, to describe more about for saying as a sample, like explaining the rules of your own work. What are you looking is maybe the best advice that I can give you.
Thank you. I have another question. You talk about the Barragán house as being a set of a sequence of lightness to darkness, darkness to lightness, and sometimes when you enter somebody's work, let's say your own, that context that you were saying is missing. I remember we were you had gone to New Haven for an exhibition at the to display your work at the Paul Rudolph building at Yale. Do you feel like your work was out of sequence there, out of context? And is there anything you would advise for people to kind of like communicate what you're meaning, what you're thinking in places that where the work doesn't really truly belong or where it really belongs?
Yes, first, I truly believe that making your own relation through spaces, making your own relation through our work is the best that we have, because we cannot be all the time to explain context, to place the information that you are looking for. But I think that is the truly meaning of timeless. Like why someone prefers a specific artist, someone prefers a specific artist, architect, because you are actually in this space. So my biggest approach with it is working in your sensibility to try to understand that you are in a space, to try to see things, to try to see textures, to try to understand solutions, try to avoid not to make conclusions if you don't truly have the rational information with you. That is something that I see every day, that people want to make opinion have any formal real information about the spaces. But I consider that something quite great because it's so organic, it's quite metaphysical, making or being in the space watching architecture. We can all talk about different spaces, iconic projects, but if you don't have the opportunity to be there, you will not understand it. That is why our own relation with everything is quite important. But then when we talk or we think more about education or maybe more specific architectural tour, artistic tour, it's also quite important to try to study, try to make a background, try to study again the context, the characteristics, proportions, solutions, references. Try to take a minute and try to observe, try to draw, try to think about the real solutions, because sometimes when we see a painting, when we see a house built, we feel that it was just like one day process and it's already end. So when you have the opportunity to study everything, all the information that happens to achieve that project is quite wonderful. The idea is to have that duality. The idea, or I always try that the rational is so important, but the imaginary subject is the one that make all the work for me, and it will feel always at that balance. So it's quite great when you are in a place that maybe you know about the architect, is something quite nice and new to learn. Try to explore maybe something that you have in your head, an opinion to say that maybe you don't like one architect's work, one artist's work, but when you have the opportunity to see it, maybe it will change your opinion. Maybe the way that he used materials interior, light, bathrooms, kitchens, it will be like your own main reference to learn about it.
Wonderful. One last question, unless anybody else is curious. Um, you, for all your life, have been immersed in architecture and in this and photography. Um, I also know that you mentioned beauty and the utilitarian, and I think food is something that kind of encompasses that.
Of
You know,
course.
we can saturate our brains with portfolio or thesis with all these themes, but do you find that you're also conceptually tied whenever you're eating food? Because I know the house throws these culinary events, right? Is your life work from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, or is it
Yes.
going?
Sorry, sorry.
Go ahead.
Ah. No, I mean that for me, food is the best way to understand people, to track culture, even more than art, even more than architecture. It's something vital, something that have an important presence in all our lives. But thinking about the house first, my parents' house was designed as a social entertaining place. So when we have the opportunity to see people eating or drinking something, people start forgetting about the iconic side of the space because it's a human activity. So it's a way that we can invite people to relax and to enjoy the space in a real way. It's a moment when architecture stops being a photography and it's more about feelings. It's more about sharing. And these kind of spaces give you the opportunity to understand life with a more anthropological approach. And that is quite great because you can understand every single activities that we are producing to people. And it can sound quite obvious, but through the time I has been understanding that people say it, but they never take it to practice. So we design something in specific, but we never care about the real people that is going to use it in a real moment, in a real activity. So food is quite great. It's amazing to travel, to drink something that is vernacular, to understand why people eat something in a specific during a specific season, during a specific country, during a specific city, because of the weather, because of the altitude. And that is quite great because our generation, we are getting used to have all kind of food during all our week, but the idea is to understand where these products came, why people eat that, and when you start understanding these elements are quite great because you understand natural references, you understand nature, and that will be always connected, especially with architecture and with art. So this is why it's so important because it's so human.
Awesome. Well, I think we're out of time unless somebody has anything to say. All right, Eduardo, I want to thank you so much for being here, taking the time out of your day to talk to us. Uh,
Please.
we'll catch you later.
Yes. Nice to meet you again.
Thank you, Eduardo.
You're welcome. De nada.